This is never going to work. The sharp voice of one of Ethan Blackwell's business partners cut through the soft hum of classical music in the background. Ethan kept his gaze locked on his untouched glass of bourbon, his icy blue eyes revealing nothing. He didn't need to look to know exactly who the cruel comment was aimed at: Sophie. She was only a few steps away, speaking politely with the wife of another investor. Her simple navy blue dress, far too understated for a party dripping with extravagance, clashed violently against the sparkling gowns and designer labels surrounding her. Sophie didn't belong there, and it was painfully obvious to everyone. The soft touch of her hand on his arm pulled Ethan out of his thoughts, a gentle reminder of her warmth. "Ethan, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice sweet, with a hopeful smile. Ethan forced a nod, his throat tightening with discomfort. Everything about this felt wrong. Sophie's kindness, her innocent gaze, her genuine simplicity, it all stood in stark contrast to the shallow opulence of the world they were in. "We're in the middle of something important," he muttered, his voice colder than he intended. Her smile faltered for a split second, though she quickly masked the disappointment with practiced grace. She stepped back, her posture composed, but Ethan caught the flash of hurt in her eyes. His damn pride had spoken for him again. The other men in the room didn't bother to hide their looks, pity thinly veiled by indifference. They were all thinking the same thing, and Ethan knew it. In their world, Sophie wasn't enough. "You need a woman who matches your status, Blackwell," his partner whispered, raising his glass in a silent toast. "Someone who knows how to play the game." Those words reverberated in Ethan's mind like a hammer against glass. Every soft smile from Sophie, every genuine laugh she offered, was now a painful reminder that she didn't, and never would, fit into his world. Later that night, as they drove home in silence, Sophie reached out gently, breaking the oppressive stillness. "Ethan, something's wrong, I can feel it." He didn't meet her gaze. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, hands clenched on the steering wheel. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed, concern clouding her face. "Did I do something wrong?" Her voice wavered slightly, not from fear, but from the pain of not understanding why the man she loved had grown so distant. Ethan pulled over, turning to face her for the first time that night. Her soft brown eyes searched his, filled with uncertainty and hope, an agonizing mix. "I want a divorce." The words cut through the air like a blade. Sophie froze, her lips parted in shock. He saw it. The exact moment her heart shattered behind her carefully composed expression. But with the grace that had always defined her, she lifted her chin and nodded slowly. "If that's what you really want." Her voice was low, steady, and heartbreakingly strong. Without another word, she opened the door, stepping out into the cold night. Ethan watched as she disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but silence and the overwhelming weight of his own regret. The glass of bourbon he had poured himself later that night slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Yet even that sharp crash wasn't enough to drown out the final image of Sophie leaving him behind. And for the first time, Ethan Blackwell realized the cost of the pride he had clung to for too long. Ethan Blackwell sat alone in his penthouse apartment, staring at the untouched glass of bourbon resting on the coffee table. The city lights of Manhattan twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, casting fractured reflections across the room. But no amount of luxury could drown out the emptiness, echoing through the sterile, silent space. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. He had convinced himself that letting Sophie go was necessary, that she didn't belong in his world of power deals, ruthless ambition, and social expectations. But now, with every minute passing since she had walked out that door, a gnawing pit of regret grew in his chest. The sound of the door closing behind her earlier had been deafening. The next morning, Sophie's absence was already too loud to ignore. Her coffee mug, always the plain white one with the tiny crack on the handle, was gone from its usual spot by the sink. Her favorite blanket, once draped casually over the arm of the couch, was folded neatly in a box by the door. The faint scent of her lavender perfume, once comforting, now taunted him like a ghost. Ethan knew she had packed her things while he sat there, pretending not to notice, too much of a coward to stop her. 2 days passed, each one colder and quieter than the last. On the third day, Ethan's assistant, Rachel, entered his office with a cautious knock. "Sir, the board meeting is scheduled for noon." He barely acknowledged her presence, eyes still locked on the city skyline beyond his office windows. "Cancel it," Rachel hesitated. "Mr. Blackwell, this meeting is crucial. Investors are expecting—" "I said cancel it." His tone was sharp, final. There was something in his voice that made Rachel step back. She had worked for Ethan long enough to recognize the undercurrents of frustration, but this time it wasn't business-related. This was personal. When she left the room, Ethan exhaled slowly, running his fingers through his dark hair. His reflection in the glass looked hollow. Tired eyes, sharp cheekbones more pronounced from nights without sleep. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built an empire on discipline, control, and unbreakable resolve, yet he couldn't keep the one person who had loved him for who he truly was. That night, Ethan found himself scrolling through his phone, hesitating over Sophie's contact. Her name blinked back at him like a wound that refused to heal. No. She deserved better than a half-hearted text or a hollow apology over the phone. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Sophie was unpacking the last of her boxes in a small, cozy apartment in Brooklyn. The space was a stark contrast to the penthouse she had shared with Ethan. No marble countertops, no skyline views. But it felt peaceful. Her best friend Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, watching her with concern. "You're too calm, Soph. Like, scary calm." "I expected at least a full-on crying session, maybe some dramatic movie binging." Sophie offered a weak smile as she folded a sweater. "I think I cried everything out the night I left. Now I just feel empty." Lily frowned. "You loved him, Sophie. Hell, you still do." "Maybe. But love isn't enough if the other person is too afraid to fight for you." Her voice cracked just slightly. The pain was there, tucked away behind her quiet composure. She had given Ethan every part of herself, her loyalty, her patience, her heart. And in the end, all she had gotten in return was silence and cold rejection. Back at his apartment, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the small, forgotten photo on his nightstand. It was a candid shot of Sophie, taken during a weekend getaway. Her hair messy from the wind, a genuine, radiant smile lighting up her face. He picked up the frame, thumb brushing over the glass. What the hell have I done? The realization was as bitter as the bourbon burning down his throat moments later. And for the first time since Sophie walked away, Ethan knew he hadn't just lost a partner. He had lost the only real happiness he had ever known. Ethan Blackwell's penthouse was nothing but a monument to silence now. The city skyline stretched endlessly before him, glittering in the night. But the lights outside couldn't pierce the darkness that had settled inside. Every corner of the apartment seemed to echo with Sophie's absence. The space where her shoes used to rest by the door, the empty spot on the bathroom counter where her skincare routine had claimed a small patch of marble, and the untouched shelf in the living room where she used to keep her favorite books. Ethan had everything: money, status, influence. But none of it could drown out the simple fact that the woman who had made this cold space feel like home was gone. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't go to work the next morning. His phone buzzed with calls from board members and texts from his assistant, Rachel, but he ignored them all. Instead, he found himself sitting at the piano in the living room, a grand black Steinway, as cold and pristine as the rest of the apartment. Sophie had loved listening to him play. His fingers hovered over the keys, and without thinking, he started to play the melody that had once been her favorite, Clair de Lune by Debussy. The soft notes drifted through the room, each one carrying a memory sharp enough to cut through his composure. The nights when Sophie would curl up on the couch, eyes closed, letting the music wash over her. The way she'd lean her head against his shoulder afterward, whispering that it was moments like those that made her feel closest to him. A lump formed in his throat and the music faltered. Why didn't I fight for her? The answer was simple: because Ethan Blackwell had been a coward. That evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone. Smiling selfies from vacations they had taken together, candid shots of Sophie reading by the window, Her laughter caught mid-motion in blurry frames, and then he reached a video. The screen lit up with a memory of Sophie in the kitchen, flour on her cheeks, attempting to bake cookies while Ethan narrated sarcastic commentary in the background. Her laughter echoed from the tiny speakers, a sound so alive, so genuine, it hit him like a punch to the gut. You threw that away for what? To impress people who don't matter. The next day, determination replaced regret. Ethan needed to see her. He called Lily, Sophie's best friend, under the pretense of returning a few things Sophie had left behind. Lily's voice on the other end was cautious, cold even. "What do you want, Ethan?" Her words were sharp, slicing through any false politeness. I need to talk to her. One conversation, please." There was a pause long enough to make him think she would hang up. "She doesn't owe you anything, you know." Ethan swallowed hard. "I know, but I owe her everything." Another pause. "She's moved out, Ethan. She's not in your world anymore. Maybe you should respect that." The call ended, but Ethan couldn't give up. Desperate, he found himself in Brooklyn later that week, standing in front of a small art gallery, the place where Sophie had once dreamed of showcasing her photography. It was quiet, almost intimate, a stark contrast to the towering office buildings and luxury hotels Ethan was used to. Through the glass, he saw her. She was different now. Sophie stood behind a display table, adjusting a frame, her hair pulled back into a simple braid. She wore no designer clothes, no jewelry, just jeans, a soft sweater, and an air of quiet confidence that made her more beautiful than any socialite he had ever known. Ethan's hand hovered over the door handle, but something inside him held him back. She looked happy, peaceful, and for the first time he wondered if his presence would only ruin that peace. He turned away before she could notice him, the weight of his choices heavier than ever. That night, as Ethan lay awake in his cold, empty bed, he realized the truth. He hadn't just pushed Sophie away. He had let her become someone else's piece, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't deserve to be part of that happiness anymore. The air inside the gallery was warm, laced with the faint scent of fresh paint and wood polish. Soft jazz played from an old speaker in the corner, blending into the hum of casual conversation from visitors drifting between the displays. For the first time in months, Sophie felt settled. The exhibit had been a personal triumph, her first solo showcase featuring moments she had captured from her quiet walks around Brooklyn. Ordinary scenes, simple moments of real life. Nothing like the glittering events she used to attend by Ethan's side, where every interaction felt like a performance. Now this was her world. And it felt real. Her confidence had bloomed in the months since she had left Ethan Blackwell's carefully constructed empire of appearances. No more designer gowns that didn't reflect who she was. No more rehearsed smiles at boardroom parties. Here she wore what made her feel comfortable. An off-the-shoulder black sweater, faded jeans, and boots that were worn but loved. But even as she adjusted a frame on the wall, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching her. Earlier that day, a lingering presence she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Or maybe... no. She shook the thought away. Ethan wouldn't come here. Not to her new life, her sanctuary. That evening, after the gallery closed, Sophie returned to her modest Brooklyn apartment. It was small, nothing compared to the sprawling penthouse she had shared with Ethan, but every detail was hers. The mismatched cushions on the couch, the shelf filled with well-read books, and the Polaroid photos stuck to the fridge with tiny magnets. This was a space built on simplicity, not perfection. As she settled onto the couch with a cup of tea, her phone vibrated on the table. A message from Lily lit up the screen. "Lily, you okay? I heard from Rachel. He's trying to reach you." Sophie's heart clenched involuntarily. "Ethan." She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button before finally setting the phone down without answering. What would she even say? "Thanks for crushing me into pieces," or worse, "I still miss you"? No, she wouldn't let herself spiral back into that. She had fought too hard to reclaim her peace. But peace wasn't something Ethan Blackwell had the luxury of feeling. He sat alone in his penthouse, the same glass of bourbon untouched beside him for hours. The city lights that once brought him a sense of triumph now seemed like hollow distractions. Every success, every carefully calculated business deal, felt meaningless without Sophie's quiet laughter filling the spaces between. He couldn't forget the way she had looked at the gallery, radiant and alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. But what haunted him more was the realization that she hadn't needed him anymore. His phone buzzed, a message from Rachel. Rachel. Sir, your absence is affecting the company. The board is getting nervous. Ethan tossed the phone aside. Let them be nervous. His mind wasn't on mergers or profits anymore. It was on the woman who had once looked at him like he was her. Whole world, and how he had shattered that trust in the name of appearances. The next weekend, fate, or perhaps something crueler, intervened. Ethan was at an exclusive charity gala in Manhattan, the kind of event where everyone wore their best masks of wealth and charm. But as he navigated the room, glass of champagne in hand, his breath caught in his throat. Her Sophie. She stood across the room, transformed in ways he hadn't thought possible. Her dark green silk dress hugged her figure with effortless elegance, subtle yet commanding attention without screaming for it. Her hair was swept back into a soft updo, strands falling gently around her face, and her eyes sparkled with a confidence he no longer recognized. But it wasn't just the way she looked. It was the way everyone else was looking at her. Sophie wasn't the quiet woman on his arm anymore. She was the center of attention, effortlessly captivating in a room full of people who had once ignored her. Their eyes met. Ethan's pulse quickened, every muscle in his body tensing with the memory of everything he had lost. She didn't smile, didn't look away, just stared back with a gaze full of calm detachment. And maybe, just maybe, a flicker of something more dangerous. Indifference. And that was the moment Ethan Blackwell realized the truth. He hadn't just lost Sophie's love, he had lost her respect. The tension in the ballroom was thick, humming beneath the polished surface of clinking glasses and polite laughter. Ethan Blackwell couldn't take his eyes off her. Sophie. Her presence consumed the room, graceful, magnetic, powerful in a way he had never truly understood until now. She wasn't just beautiful, she was confident, self-assured, and completely untouchable. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the most powerful person in the room. He watched as a man, tall, sharply dressed, and clearly familiar, leaned in to whisper something into Sophie's ear. She laughed, tossing her head back slightly, exposing the elegant curve of her neck. That sound, that effortless, melodic laugh once reserved for Ethan alone, now belonged to someone else. Jealousy surged through him like fire. Without thinking, his feet moved toward her. The polished floor gleamed beneath his shoes, as if daring him to approach her without preparation. Every step felt heavier, as the weight of regret bore down on his shoulders. When Sophie finally noticed him cutting through the crowd, her lips curved into a small, deliberate smile, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ethan. Her voice was smooth, calm, like she'd expected him to come crawling eventually. Didn't think this was your scene anymore. Apparently neither is yours. His tone was low, almost dangerous, but she didn't flinch. Instead, her gaze met his with unwavering confidence. People change. Her smile widened, cold and detached. Some of us, at least. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself not to show weakness. Every fiber of his being screamed to pull her close, to remind her of what they had shared, what they could have again. But he knew better. Sophie wasn't the woman he had left behind. She was stronger now, more dangerous, and she was playing the game better than he ever had. The man beside her cleared his throat, offering Ethan a firm handshake. I don't believe we've met. Daniel Carter. Ethan shook his hand, noting the subtle dominance in Daniel's grip, the way his arm remained casually but protectively draped around Sophie's waist. A silent message. She's not alone anymore. Ethan Blackwell. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. The Ethan Blackwell, I've heard plenty about you. I'm sure you have. Ethan's smile was tight, sharp like glass. Sophie watched the exchange with an amused flicker in her gaze, as if daring Ethan to lose his composure. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Not yet. It's a surprise seeing you here, Sophie. Ethan finally said, turning his attention back to her. "I didn't think you'd return to these kinds of events." "Why not?" Her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "I'm not hiding from anyone. Unlike some people, I don't let other people's expectations define me anymore." The words landed with precision, cutting through the polished pretense. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Maybe I was wrong about us." His voice dropped low enough that only she could hear. "But I don't intend to keep making the same mistakes." Sophie's breath hitched, so subtle it could have gone unnoticed, but Ethan saw it. A flicker of something deeper beneath her carefully built walls. "Why you don't get to rewrite the past, Ethan," she whispered, leaning in so close that he could feel the heat of her breath against his ear. "You made your choices, and I made mine." Before he could respond, she turned away, her hand resting gently on Daniel's arm as they moved toward the dance floor, leaving Ethan standing there alone in a sea of strangers. Later that night, after the gala had faded into nothing more than distant laughter and forgotten toasts, Ethan found himself staring at his reflection in the penthouse window. His phone vibrated on the table, another message from Rachel, another ignored board meeting. None of it mattered. All that consumed his mind now was Sophie's voice, the quiet venom in her words, the wall of indifference she had built around herself. For the first time, Ethan Blackwell realized he was no longer in control of this game. And if he wanted to win her back, he would have to play by her rules. The night air in Manhattan was thick with possibility, but inside the dimly lit lounge of the hotel, the tension between Ethan and Sophie was unbearable. Ethan leaned against the bar, his bourbon untouched, eyes fixed on her from across the room. Sophie was radiant in her emerald green dress, a color that made her eyes glow under the low light. Every subtle movement she made, each flick of her hair, every shift of her weight, was effortlessly magnetic. But it wasn't just the way she looked that drew him in. It was the confidence she wore now like armor. She wasn't the woman who had once shrunk under the weight of his indifference. This Sophie was fire and ice, a woman who knew exactly the effect she had on him and wielded it with quiet precision. When she finally noticed him, her gaze was calculated, cool, detached, yet sparking with unspoken heat. Ethan couldn't resist any longer. He crossed the room, slow and measured, as if stalking prey. Sophie didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply sipped her drink, her lips barely curving into a faint, amused smile. "Following me now?" Her voice was velvet and challenge wrapped into one. "I wasn't aware I needed an invitation." Ethan's voice was low, the kind of dangerous smoothness that once made her knees weak. "You don't, but that doesn't mean you're welcome." The space between them was thin, charged like a storm waiting to break. Ethan leaned closer, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of her perfume, something floral, delicate, but with an underlying spice that made his pulse spike. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sophie." Her smile sharpened. "Funny, I was about to say the same to you." The music slowed, the heavy bass of a sensual rhythm vibrating through the room. Without asking, Ethan extended his hand, the unspoken invitation clear. For a heartbeat, Sophie hesitated. Then she placed her fingers lightly in his. The moment their hands touched, it was as if the world narrowed to just the two of them. Ethan guided her onto the dance floor, their bodies close but not touching. Yet, the heat radiating between them was unbearable, every movement drawing them closer. His hand rested on the small of her back, a deliberate touch that sent electricity crawling up her spine. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" she asked, her voice breathless but steady. "You." His reply was instant, brutal in its honesty. Sophie's heart stuttered, but she masked the reaction with a soft laugh, tilting her head slightly. "You had me once, and you let me go." Ethan's fingers pressed just a little deeper into her back, drawing her an inch closer. "I made mistakes." His breath grazed her ear. "But I don't intend to make them again." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes burning with challenge and something dangerously close to longing. "You're assuming I want to be caught. So you're assuming I'll let you walk away again." Their bodies moved in perfect rhythm, the space between them shrinking until there was none left. The air was thick with tension, every brush of fabric against fabric, every breath shared between them laced with unspoken promises and regrets. When the song ended, neither of them moved. Sophie was the first to speak, her voice barely more than a whisper. "This doesn't change anything, Ethan. It changes everything." Later, in the privacy of her hotel suite, Sophie stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her pulse still raced from the heat of his touch, the memory of his breath on her neck. "You're stronger now," she reminded herself. "You don't need him anymore." But as much as she hated to admit it, part of her craved the danger of falling into his arms again. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city's endless lights. He had felt it, the connection that still burned between them. This wasn't just about unfinished business. This was about winning her back, no matter what it took, and Ethan Blackwell never lost. The rain traced lazy patterns down the windows of Ethan Blackwell's penthouse, the city beyond glowing with the muted gold of streetlights and neon signs. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside him, an electric, restless energy he couldn't shake. He didn't expect to hear a knock at his door, and he definitely didn't expect to open it and find Sophie standing there, soaked from the rain, her eyes burning with something dangerously close to defiance and desire. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's gaze trailed from the damp strands of hair clinging to her neck, down to the way her dress clung to every curve of her body, made even more sinful by the rain. His pulse quickened, every instinct screaming to pull her inside. Instead, his voice came out low, thick with tension. "You shouldn't be here." Sophie lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the heat in her eyes. "I know." Before he could stop himself, Ethan reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair behind her ear. The air between them crackled like a live wire. "Why are you here, Sophie?" "Because I hate how much I still want you." That was all it took for restraint to snap like a brittle thread. Ethan's hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her inside with a roughness that sent shivers down her spine. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the world as if it no longer existed. His mouth was on hers in an instant, urgent, desperate, full of the pain of every second they had spent apart. Sophie melted into him, her fingers knotting in, his hair as their bodies collided, the heat of their desire burning away any lingering hesitation. Clothes fell away in a blur of need. Ethan lifted her effortlessly, carrying her through the shadows of the apartment until her back hit the cold glass of the window, the city lights framing the outline of their entangled bodies. "Tell me to stop," Ethan growled against her throat, his voice hoarse. But Sophie didn't stop him. Instead, she arched into his touch, her nails raking down his back as she whispered, breathless, "Don't you dare." Every inch of her skin was alive under his hands, every kiss a reminder of what they had lost and what still burned fiercely between them. Sophie's senses drowned in him, the taste of his mouth, the rough scrape of his stubble against her jaw, the scent of his cologne mixed with something raw and primal. Her body remembered every inch of him, every place where his touch once lingered. But this wasn't like before. This was desperate, dangerous. And as they collapsed onto his bed, tangled in sheets and each other's bodies, the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. Every movement was an unspoken apology, every gasp a plea for forgiveness. Neither of them could speak aloud. Hours later, Sophie lay on her side, tracing patterns on Ethan's bare chest with the tip of her finger. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the storm inside them hadn't passed. "This doesn't fix anything," she murmured, voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. Ethan's hand covered hers, pressing it flat against his heart. "I know, but I don't want to lose you again." Sophie closed her eyes, fighting the pull of something deeper than lust, something far more dangerous. "You already did, Ethan." His jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Because deep down he knew she was right. This night had been their weakness, their surrender to old habits and familiar desires. But come morning, the past they had tried so hard to forget would still be waiting for them, and the real battle for forgiveness and redemption had only just begun. The sun barely peeked through the heavy curtains of Ethan Blackwell's penthouse when Sophie stirred, tangled in the sheets and remnants of a night they both knew shouldn't have happened. For a fleeting second, the warmth of his body pressed against hers felt comforting, familiar in a way that made her chest ache. But as the haze of desire faded, reality came rushing back in. This doesn't change anything. Carefully, Sophie slipped out of bed, gathering her clothes from the floor in silence. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, with memories of tenderness now layered beneath months of hurt. As she buttoned up her blouse, her eyes wandered across the room, resting on the stark, minimalist decor. Every inch of this place was cold and calculated, a reflection of the man who had once pushed her away. But then something caught her attention. A small wooden box sat slightly ajar on his desk, out of place in the otherwise sterile space. Curiosity got the better of her. Inside, nestled among old photographs and scattered documents, was a small, colorful drawing, clumsily scribbled dinosaurs in bright blues and greens. The crude handwriting at the bottom read, "To Mum, love Lucas." Sophie's heart stopped. Her breath hitched, and she quickly closed the box, swallowing hard. How long had Ethan had that drawing? And why? Her mind spun with questions she wasn't ready to confront. Lucas. The secret she had worked so hard to protect suddenly didn't feel so secret anymore. Before she could gather her thoughts, Ethan's voice broke the silence, rough with sleep, but sharp with awareness. "What are you doing?" Sophie turned, clutching her coat tighter around herself. "Nothing," she said too quickly. "I was just leaving." Ethan sat up in bed, the sheets pooling around his waist, his gaze narrowing at the tension in her voice. "Sophie, wait." But she was already out the door before he could finish. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sophie couldn't focus on anything. Not her work, not the emails stacking up in her inbox, not even the comforting routines she had built for herself since walking away from Ethan's world. How did he find out? Does he know everything? She tried to push the thought aside as she picked Lucas up from school, but when her son climbed into the back seat with his usual grin, something inside her cracked. "Mom, can we go get ice cream?" Lucas asked, swinging his legs excitedly. Sophie forced a smile, reaching back to tousle his dark brown hair. Hair so much like Ethan's it made her stomach twist. "Sure, baby. Ice cream sounds perfect." Meanwhile, Ethan stared at the now closed wooden box on his desk, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The drawing had been left behind by accident, tucked inside a folder Rachel had given him during a meeting weeks ago. At first, it had meant nothing, just a misplaced piece of a stranger's life. But then he noticed the handwriting. Lucas. The name had gnawed at him for days. Now, seeing Sophie's reaction, the truth began to crystallize in his mind. And it hit him like a punch to the gut. Was Lucas his son? That night, Ethan stood outside Sophie's Brooklyn apartment, the drawing clenched in his hand like a ticking bomb. His finger hovered over the doorbell, uncertainty gnawing at him. What if she's kept this from me for a reason? Before he could talk himself out of it, the door swung open. Sophie stood there wearing an oversized sweater and exhaustion in her eyes. She froze the moment she saw what he held. "We need to talk." His voice was low, steady, but heavy with unspoken accusations. "Not now, Ethan." Her voice trembled, but there was fire in her gaze. "Lucas is inside. He doesn't know anything about you." Then it's time he did. Sophie stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "You don't get to show up here and demand things." "Is he mine?" Ethan's voice cracked, just enough to let the vulnerability slip through. Sophie's breath caught. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." The words hung between them, raw and painful. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Because you weren't ready to love anyone but yourself, Ethan, and I wouldn't let Lucas be hurt by the same man who shattered me." For the first time, Ethan understood the depth of what he had lost. Not just Sophie, but the years of fatherhood he would never get back. And for once, Ethan Blackwell didn't know if there was anything left to fight for. The weight of the truth pressed down on Ethan Blackwell like a vice tightening around his chest. As he drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, Sophie's words echoed in his mind like a cruel refrain. You weren't ready to love anyone but yourself. And now, because of his own arrogance and fear, he had missed out on 5 years of his son's life. Lucas is mine. The thought was both staggering and gut-wrenching. He remembered Sophie's hesitation, the guarded look in her eyes, and the way she had protected their son with every fiber of her being. Ethan hadn't just broken her heart. He had proven himself unworthy of the trust she had once given him so freely. How could I have been so blind? The following morning, Ethan found himself parked near Lucas's school, watching from a distance as children spilled onto the playground in bursts of laughter and chaotic joy. His heart clenched when he spotted Lucas among them. The resemblance was undeniable. The same wavy chestnut hair, the sharp angle of his jawline, and, when Lucas turned toward his friends with a bright grin, his own smile reflected back at him. With startling clarity, for a long moment Ethan couldn't breathe. That was his son. Not an abstract idea or a missed opportunity. A real child, full of life, curiosity, and joy. I should have been there for all of it. Every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story. His regret sank deeper, a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of success or wealth could fill. Later that evening, unable to contain the storm of emotions any longer, Ethan went to Sophie's apartment. This time, when she opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see him. "I told you, Ethan, I don't want him getting hurt." Her voice was tired, edged with frustration. "I won't hurt him." His voice cracked as he spoke. "I swear to you, Sophie, I won't." Sophie crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You left, Ethan. You walked away from me when I needed you the most. Why should I believe you won't do the same to him?" Ethan's throat tightened. He took a cautious step closer but didn't dare touch her. "Because I didn't know then what I was walking away from." His voice softened, raw with honesty. "I thought I was protecting myself from something that didn't fit into my world. But the truth is you were my world, and Lucas..." He exhaled shakily. "Lucas is my world too. I just didn't know it until now." For the first time, Sophie's defenses wavered. Her arms loosened at her sides and her voice dropped to a whisper. "It's not just about showing up now, Ethan. It's about being there for him every day, about proving that you're not going to disappear again." "I'll prove it." Ethan's gaze burned with determination. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but let me be part of his life, even if it's only as a friend for now." Sophie looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater as she wrestled with the decision. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "You can meet him, but you tell him you're an old friend. Nothing more. Not yet." The words were a bittersweet concession, but to Ethan they felt like a lifeline. "Thank you, Sophie." The next afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting nervously in Sophie's modest living room, his pulse thudding like a drum in his chest. Then Lucas entered the room, clutching a small toy dinosaur in his hand. "Hi," the boy said, tilting, his head curiously. "Who are you?" Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I'm Ethan, a friend of your mom's." Lucas studied him for a moment before breaking into a grin. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Relief surged through Ethan like a wave of warmth. "Actually, I love dinosaurs." Lucas's eyes lit up as he held up his toy. "This one's a T-Rex. He's the biggest and strongest of them all." Ethan smiled, something deep and paternal stirring in his chest. "You know, when I was your age, the T-Rex was my favorite too." Sophie watched the interaction from the doorway, her heart tight in her chest. There was something different in Ethan's voice, gentler, more genuine. And as Lucas eagerly pulled Ethan toward his toy box to show off his collection, she wondered if, maybe, Ethan was finally becoming the man he should have been all along. But this time she wouldn't trust words, she would trust his actions. The late afternoon sun spilled into Sophie's apartment, casting long shadows across the floor as Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room rug, surrounded by plastic dinosaurs, blocks, and laughter. Lucas beamed as he explained the intricate differences between a Triceratops and a Stegosaurus, his voice full of excitement. Ethan listened attentively, nodding and offering exaggerated reactions to every fact. "You're really smart, Lucas," Ethan said, ruffling the boy's hair gently. "I think you might know more about dinosaurs than I ever did." Lucas beamed with pride. "Maybe you could come back next time and help me build my dinosaur fort." Ethan's heart clenched at how natural this felt. "How right? I'd love to," he replied, his voice tight with emotion. But as Ethan glanced toward Sophie, standing silently in the doorway, her arms crossed, he could see the weight behind her guarded expression. This wasn't just a bonding moment. It was a test. A test of whether or not he was truly ready to be the father Lucas deserved. Later, after Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch, Ethan carefully draped a blanket over him and rose quietly. Sophie motioned for him to follow her into the kitchen, where the warmth of the moment dissolved into a heavy, lingering silence. "That was," she started, clearing her throat, "better than I expected." Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I want to be here for him, Sophie, every day, not just for playdates or short visits." Sophie's eyes darkened and her voice lowered. "You say that now, Ethan, but where were you when I found out I was pregnant? When I spent sleepless nights wondering if I could raise him alone?" The accusation hit like a hammer to his chest. "I didn't know," Ethan said quietly. "You didn't tell me. Would it have made a difference?" Her eyes flashed with pain. "You left, Ethan. You made it clear I didn't belong in your perfect world." The weight of her words settled like stone in the pit of his stomach. He had been selfish, driven by ego, blind to the love she had offered so selflessly. "You're right," Ethan admitted, voice rough with remorse. "I made choices that hurt you, but I swear, Sophie, I'm not the same man who walked away from you." Sophie looked down, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. "And how am I supposed to trust that? How do I know you won't leave again when things get complicated?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft but steady. "Because I love him." Sophie's breath hitched. "And me?" The question hung in the air, thick with vulnerability and rawness. Ethan swallowed hard, reaching for her hand. "I never stopped loving you, Sophie." For a heartbeat, the walls she had built so carefully wavered. But then, just as quickly, she pulled her hand away. "Love wasn't enough before, Ethan." Her voice cracked with exhaustion. "And I don't think it's enough now. Not until you prove that you're staying, for good." That night, Ethan left her apartment with the image of Lucas sleeping peacefully burned into his memory, and the weight of Sophie's distrust pressing against his heart. He knew words weren't enough anymore. If he wanted a place in Lucas's life and in Sophie's heart, he would have to earn it, not with promises, but with actions. The next few weeks became a test of Ethan Blackwell's resolve. Gone were the extravagant gestures, the expensive gifts and grand speeches. In their place came quiet, consistent efforts, small moments of showing up when it mattered most. It started with the simplest of things. He attended Lucas's school science fair, standing quietly in the back as his son enthusiastically explained his project on dinosaur ecosystems. Every word out of Lucas's mouth was filled with passion and excitement, and Ethan watched with a mixture of awe and regret. When Lucas's project won second place, Ethan was there, clapping louder than anyone else. After the fair, Lucas ran into his arms without hesitation. "You came." Lucas's grin was pure joy. "Of course I did," Ethan replied, ruffling his son's hair. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." Across the room, Sophie watched the scene unfold, arms crossed, the hint of a smile softening her features. She wasn't ready to let him back into her heart completely. Not yet. But she couldn't deny the sincerity behind his efforts. Ethan's consistency didn't stop there. Every Saturday, he and Lucas spent time together, whether it was visiting museums, watching documentaries, or simply playing with toy dinosaurs on the living room floor. With each visit, the bond between father and son deepened, built on trust, laughter, and shared curiosity. But Ethan didn't stop at being just a good father. He wanted to prove to Sophie that he was becoming a better man. Late one evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Ethan found Sophie quietly cleaning up the remnants of their makeshift art project. "Can I help?" His voice was soft, non-intrusive. Sophie hesitated, then handed him a cloth. They worked side by side in silence, the air thick with unspoken thoughts, until Sophie finally spoke. "You're really trying." "Because I need to," Ethan replied without hesitation. "Not for me, for him. And for you." Sophie's hands stilled, and for the first time her walls seemed to lower just a little. "He's happier," she admitted quietly. "He looks forward to seeing you." Ethan's voice was hoarse when he answered. "He deserves that, and so do you." Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second the distance between them seemed to disappear. One night, as Ethan was leaving, Lucas ran up to him, clutching a crumpled drawing in his small hands. "Dad!" The word froze Ethan in place. His breath hitched. "Dad, it wasn't forced. It wasn't prompted by anyone else. Lucas had said it on his own." "Yeah, buddy." Ethan knelt to Lucas's level. Lucas held out the drawing, a picture of the two of them standing in front of a giant T-Rex, hand in hand. "It's for you," Lucas said shyly. Ethan's voice broke as he pulled his son into a tight hug. "Thank you, Lucas. This means everything to me." Sophie watched from the hallway, her throat tightening with a wave of emotions she could no longer suppress. There was no denying it anymore. Ethan wasn't just trying, he was changing. Later that night, as Ethan prepared to leave, Sophie stopped him at the door. "You're doing more than I expected," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And I appreciate it." Ethan looked at her with a tenderness that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with genuine care. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here. For him and for you." For the first time in months, she believed him. Not because of what he said, but because of what he had done. And though she didn't say it aloud, a small part of her heart whispered the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. The crisp chill of autumn swept through Brooklyn's narrow streets, leaves scattering in shades of red, gold, and amber. Inside Sophie's cozy apartment, laughter echoed from the living room, filling the space with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor, his toy dinosaurs lined up, in perfect formation. Ethan knelt beside him, patiently listening as his son explained the rules of their imaginary prehistoric kingdom. "The T-Rex is the strongest, but the Velociraptor is the smartest," Lucas said with a grin, his enthusiasm bubbling over. Ethan chuckled, ruffling Lucas's hair. "Sounds like a good team to me." From the kitchen doorway, Sophie watched them silently, her arms crossed as she leaned against the frame. The tenderness in Ethan's eyes, the way Lucas clung to every word his father spoke. This was no longer the man who had walked away from them. This was someone different, someone who had earned his place in their lives. After dinner, with Lucas fast asleep in his room, the apartment settled into a comfortable stillness. Sophie cleared the plates while Ethan dried them, their movements quiet and easy, like two people who had long since fallen into a rhythm. But tonight, something was different. As Ethan placed the final dish on the shelf, he turned to Sophie, hesitating before speaking. "I need to tell him the truth soon." Sophie's hand froze mid-motion, a dish towel dangling from her fingers. "Ethan, Not now," he interrupted softly, "but soon. He deserves to know who I really am, and I won't do it unless you're ready too." Her heart clenched. She had spent so long guarding Lucas from the pain she feared Ethan would bring, but the man standing in front of her now was no longer the selfish billionaire who once prioritized status over love. "He's not ready," she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "And maybe I'm not either." Ethan stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her arm. "Then I'll wait until you both are. But I'm not going anywhere, Sophie." His sincerity was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, Sophie let herself believe him. The following weekend, a charity gala loomed, a reminder of the life Sophie had left behind. Ethan had been invited, as always, but this time he extended the invitation to Sophie. "You should come," he said, his voice gentle. "Not for the people there, but for you. You deserve to be seen for who you've become." Sophie hesitated. "I'm not part of that world anymore, Ethan. You're part of my world, and you always will be." The sincerity in his voice left her breathless, and against every instinct to protect her heart, she agreed. The night of the gala, Sophie stepped into the grand ballroom in a deep navy gown that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers. Every head, turned as she entered, but her focus was solely on Ethan, who stood near the bar, his gaze locking onto hers the second she arrived. He crossed the room in a few strides, offering his hand without a word. "You look stunning," Ethan murmured, his voice low and reverent. Sophie's lips curved into a soft smile. "You clean up pretty well yourself." They moved to the dance floor, swaying in sync to the soft rhythm of the music. For the first time since their reunion, there was no tension between them, only quiet understanding and unspoken forgiveness. "Why now?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm done hiding," Ethan replied. "From you, from Lucas, from everything I should have fought for from the beginning." Sophie's breath hitched, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. "And what if I'm not ready to forgive you yet?" Ethan's hand tightened gently around hers. "Then I'll wait. For as long as it takes." The night ended with a drive through the empty streets of Manhattan, the city lights reflecting off the windows of Ethan's car. As they pulled up outside her apartment, Sophie hesitated before speaking. "Lucas needs to know soon." Ethan turned to her, his expression softening. "I'll be there when you're ready." Sophie leaned in, brushing a kiss to his cheek, a small gesture but one that carried the weight of everything unsaid. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time in a long time, Ethan let himself hope. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something real, something worth fighting for. The sun cast a soft golden glow over Prospect Park, where families gathered for picnics, children laughed in the distance, and the air was thick with the warmth of a late spring afternoon. Ethan sat on a picnic blanket, watching as Lucas ran through the grass, his laughter echoing across the open field. His son's tiny hands clutched a plastic T-Rex, roaring with playful ferocity as he chased after a group of imaginary prey. This moment, this life, was something Ethan had once believed was beyond his reach. And now, it was everything. Sophie sat beside him, her legs tucked beneath her as she sipped from a paper coffee cup. She glanced at Ethan, catching him watching Lucas with an expression so full of quiet joy that her heart ached in the best possible way. "You're really here," she said softly. Ethan turned toward her, offering a small, genuine smile. "I told you I would be." There was no grand declaration, no elaborate promises, just quiet certainty he was staying. Sophie reached out, resting her hand over his, their fingers intertwining with ease now, without the hesitation of old wounds lingering between them. "Lucas knows, doesn't he?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan nodded slowly. "He asked me if I was his dad last night." A soft chuckle escaped him. "I told him the truth." "And?" "He said—" Ethan swallowed hard, the memory still fresh. "He said he already knew." Sophie blinked, her throat tightening with emotion. "You're a good father, Ethan. I'm trying to be." His eyes met hers, serious and steady. "And I want to be a better man. For him. And for you." Sophie leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek, a gesture that was no longer tentative, no longer uncertain. "You already are." As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees, Lucas ran back toward them, breathless and flushed with excitement. "Dad!" he called out, launching himself into Ethan's arms. Ethan caught him effortlessly, holding him close, the weight of the word Dad sinking into his bones in the best possible way. "I'm here, buddy. Always." Sophie watched them, her heart full and steady for the first time in years. They hadn't just built a family, they had rebuilt trust, love, and something even stronger than what they had before. This wasn't a second chance. It was a new beginning, and this time, none of them were going to let it slip away. This story wasn't just about love lost and found. It was about growth, redemption, and the courage to face the consequences of past mistakes. Ethan's journey shows us that true change isn't proven through grand gestures, but through small, consistent actions that rebuild trust over time. Sophie's strength reminds us that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the pain, but allowing room for healing when the person who hurt us proves they've truly changed. And Lucas, He's the perfect symbol of what matters most: unconditional love, resilience, and the importance of showing up for those who need us. Sometimes life offers second chances, but it's up to us to fight for them with humility, patience, and sincerity. Now it's your turn. What would you have done if you were in Sophie's place? Could you forgive someone who broke your trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't stop here. If stories of redemption and real heartfelt connections inspire you, make sure to watch the next video. A brand new romance filled with passion, challenges, and an unforgettable twist. Click now and let's dive into a new love story together. You won't want to miss it.